You know what lens I haven't seen anyone talk about in a while? That would be Sony's 100mm STF G lens. It came out with a whole lot of press, and immediately people stopped talking about it. Maybe they were talking about the Sigma lenses, maybe they were talking about the Tamron lens, maybe they were talking about dual card slots and everything that they could imagine, but people stopped talking about this lens. And is there a reason? Should we be ignoring it? Or is it something that's actually really special, hidden right in plain sight? Let's get into it. So, the 100mm STF G Sony lens. We don't see people talking about this lens anymore. And that made me think, was there a reason that it kind of lost attention? Is there a reason that people are ignoring it? Well, I shot with this for a weekend, shooting a birds of prey workshop, and you're going to see those images here in a little bit. We're going to examine them, take a look at detail and color, take a look at how good the imagery is off of it, and then we're going to ask some very important questions about this lens, and then we are going to give it a totally important and not at all arbitrary rating. But before that, a little discussion on the lens. STF stands for Smooth Trans Focus Lens. This specifically refers to an apodization element inside of the lens. Now this loses light in order to smooth out the background defocused area, so the quality of the bokeh that the lens produces. So we're willing to lose light in order to control the background. So this is a lens entirely about background. That's its goal, is beautiful up-close sharpness and beautiful defocused background. Now, to make that work, we're losing light out of the lens past the aperture. So while the aperture is an f2.8 to 20, its t-stop is t5.6 to 22. Now, if you're not comfortable with what a t-stop is, I do have a video on my channel. Go and check it out to make sure that you're comfortable with the nomenclature. But this is the only lens I've ever seen that begins its aperture ring describing t-stops and then switches over to describing f-stops. It's very unusual. Before we get into that idea of it, let's just take a look at some of the features, because as far as a prime lens goes, this lens is loaded down with features. Let's just take a look at a couple. So it has an anti-reflective coating. It has control in its elements to control for chromatic aberration. It has an upgraded focusing motor. It has an aperture ring, and if you've watched this channel before, you know how I feel about an aperture ring. Love it. The aperture ring has click control on it. Love it. The aperture ring describes t-stops and f-stops. Little weird. We're going to get into that. What else does this lens have? Well, it's got stabilization. And many of the primes inside of this system do not have stabilization. This one does. Very, very cool. What else does it have? It has an 11-blade aperture. Now, an 11-blade aperture means that we have even nicer and smoother background defocused elements, which is very cool. So there's a lot going on with this lens. What is a misstep in the lens? Well, it's got a piece right next to the aperture ring that you turn to tell it I'm focusing up close. It's a focus limiting switch on it, and that's the kind of thing we expect to see on a 100 to 400. We expect to see it on a macro, like Sony's 90 macro, and we have it here, and this is just weird. The reason it's weird is this is not a macro lens. It's a 1:4 magnification. That's it. That is not macro. It's not even approaching 1:1. And so having that switch, I think, makes it just a little bit more cumbersome to use without adding a feature really to the lens. What else is there? It's a little bit weird to have t-stop listed on the lens as well as f-stop. And having t-stop listed at all for a lens that's not for video is a little strange, which means to use this lens, you've got to be comfortable with what a t-stop is and understand where you're losing light and how that affects your exposure. And that means that it's not particularly good for beginners who aren't really comfortable with that nomenclature. Moreover, if you are using an APS-C camera, this lens is pretty telephoto, 100mm. And so I don't feel that that's a particularly good focal length to be working with when you have a prime and you're shooting with an APS-C camera. And I imagine in my beginner's usage category that my kind of target person I'm talking about is using an APS-C camera, so I think that that makes it a little bit difficult to use. But it's weather sealed, it's built solidly, and it still is light. So what was it like to work with this lens? Honestly, I didn't love it. I did not love my shooting experience. Now, I think what that taught me was that this lens needs to be used for very specific subject matter. I was shooting birds of prey, and I had several up-close portraiture type of shots, but you've got to be pretty close on full frame to get the type of framing that you want out of this lens. And so it wasn't a beautiful experience shooting with it in that environment. I am going to take this lens out again at some point and do portraiture with it because I think that's where it sings. So I didn't love it leaving the shoot, and I didn't love it until I came home and took a look at the images. We're going to take a look at that in a second. And initially, I thought this would not do well in my rating system. But, and I think this was a good test of my rating system, it ended up doing pretty well because it still hits all the markers that I feel are important, even if my shooting experience just wasn't stellar. And that just means that it's very specified. It's not a general purpose lens. It's too specific and too good at one job to be a general lens. It's specific to a portraiture, really controlling blurred background environment. This is a kind of lens that you're going to use at t5.6 pretty much the whole time if you own it or use it. I never took it out of its brightest aperture at all when shooting it. That was just where it made sense. But let's not just talk about it. Let's go and take a look at these images.
So here we have an image. And first, I just want to take a look at the color. Its color contrast, its color vibrancy really was completely on point. And that's just stunning as it is. We've got a lot of different color saturations here in this shoot that I did, and color was just beautiful all the way through. Now let's take a look at detail, and I was shocked by this. Let's just go ahead and take this thing into 100%, which is my preferred point of examination. Let's let this render in, and take a look at that. This lens at 100% is as clear as almost any lens I've ever shot just natively. It's unreal. This happens all the way through. Here's the next one, and let's go down to the bird and let it render in here. And there's that one, just beautiful. Let's skip ahead to, well, here's a nice one here. Let's not even skip around. Let's take a look and let this guy render in. And at every stage of this, detail is exquisite. All the way through the lens. I'm really blown away by it. And that's the same in all of these images, no matter what. Well, now let's take a look at background. And it's really built for circular highlights, and that does not really transfer to other background. So here I was specifically testing the minimum focusing distance of the lens, shooting under a meter distance away with the switch turned on for that minimum focusing distance. It's not a rounded background, but it certainly is nicely blurred. And that's all nice and well and good. Here's a nice shot, and it's a pleasing background defocus. By no means would I call that particularly circular. All of these, by the way, were shot at maximum aperture, which is, of course, 2.8 with the lens, but that's a t-stop of 5.6. When I'm farther away, of course, it really isn't as blurred as the first one that we saw. And that's probably one of the biggest issues with the lens that I had was if you want this kind of background here, you've got to be right up next to your subject. At medium distances, you're just not producing that background. You're producing a very normal and yet quite pleasing background. So that's kind of my take on the image quality. In the end, though, there's just nothing to complain about image quality-wise with this lens. It's really fantastic. And with that said, it's time for us to ask some very important questions regarding this lens.
No. No.
Let's get this thing underway and start with the beginner usage category. And of course, we begin that with ease of use, which is going to get a 2 out of 5. It gets a 2 out of 5 because it's not the most intuitive lens. You need to know what a t-stop is. You need to be comfortable with an aperture ring. You need to understand what this is really built for in order to understand it. In fact, it's only saved from being a 1 out of 5 because of its size and weight, which are really nice. Speaking of which, let's get into size and weight. It gets a 3 out of 5. It gets a 3 out of 5 because it is small, it is light as far as professional glass prime lenses go, but for a beginner, and that is what I'm rating this on, it is still larger of a prime than they might expect, and so it's going to suffer a little bit there. Flexibility, it's going to suffer again. This is the first time I have to give something a 1 out of 5 in flexibility. You have effectively a t-stop that's dragging this down to 5.6, even though its f-stop is not that. It's something that does not zoom. It's medium telephoto, and I'm imagining this lens for a beginner on an APS-C camera, which is an equivalency of 150 millimeter, and that's just not the most flexible thing to work with. Growth potential, though, is quite nice. I'm going to give this a 3 out of 5. You learn to use an aperture ring. You learn what a t-stop is. You learn to understand background control. You don't really start working with something that's labeled with f2.8 lenses or f2 lenses here, but it is still quite nice. Coolness factor, it's a G Master lens. It's cool. Lenses with aperture rings are cool. I just decided that. So it's going to get a 4 out of 5. And yet, despite that, I just don't think I can give it a point for dopeness. And as a result, it gets a 13 out of 25. Let's move on to the enthusiast usage category. It's going to do much better here. Build quality is 5 out of 5. It's just rock solid. It's beautifully built. It's also small and light, and I don't know how they pulled that off, but they did. Image quality is also a 5 out of 5. Just incredible image quality off of this guy. Speed. This is lightweight lens elements and an upgraded focusing motor. It's fast. It's going to be a 4 out of 5. It would get a 5 out of 5, but I expected it to be fast, and so it didn't surprise me in any way. Features, I really struggled with. Initially, I thought that this was a lower feature kind of lens, and yet upon reflection, I'm wrong about that. Looking at it, it is stabilized. It has an aperture ring. It's an 11-blade diaphragm. This lens has quite a bit of features to it, so it's something that's quite nice and richly featured as a prime lens goes, so I have to give it a 4 out of 5. It would have received a 5 out of 5, but that filter that brings it down to a t-stop of 5.6 really made it so that I couldn't do that. Value, though, I have to give it a 2 out of 5. The reason is, what am I going to shoot with this lens? Probably a portrait, and I've got a lot of options to shoot portraits on this system. The 85mm Batis, the 85 G Master, the 85 Sony, the 85 Sigma, the 85 Loxia lens, and the 90mm macro. Most of those are less expensive than this lens. And the only one more expensive is the 85mm G Master. Would I rather shoot a portrait with the 85 G Master? I probably would. That brings our total in the enthusiast usage category to 20 out of 25. Still a really nice showing for a lens that is quite fantastic in its own right.
So what do I think about the lens? This lens totally changed my mind when I took a look at the images. I think that you need to know exactly the shooting situation you're going to be in to use this lens. But if you're doing half-body head and shoulder portraiture, this lens is amazing. Its color's unreal. Its detail is unreal. It's light. It still is stabilized. It's just something really special when you get the results back. 11-blade aperture, fantastic. Having aperture ring and click control, fantastic. This is really something special, but I have to caution, it's not a general purpose lens in the way that I might think of a 50mm as a general purpose prime. This is very specific. So for the person who uses this set of features, it's unreal. And that's really something special considering how many lenses this competes against. But if you're not in that specific category of users, it's probably not the lens for you. And that's okay. This is a lens that is meant to be good at one job, and if you're not that customer, no apologies are made. And that's okay. I like things that are really specific at a job. So I'm glad this ended up scoring well in the enthusiast category because it really now is starting to gain a special place in my heart, and I'm excited about taking this lens and using it again. So that's what I think. Is there a lens that you want me to take a look at? Is there a part of this lens that you thought needed a little bit different attention? Is there a subject matter you want me to tackle? Get in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. In the meantime, give us a like, give us a subscribe. It means a lot to me, and thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.